By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall. It arrived like an unwanted relative with too much luggage and settled in for the duration. It was a persistent, soaking drizzle that shrouded the surrounding mountains in a bruised purple mist and turned the waters of the loch the colour of cold tea. Constable Hamish Macbeth viewed this meteorological misery from the profound comfort of the lounge bar in the Lochdubh Hotel. He was not, strictly speaking, on duty. But then again, Hamish was rarely, strictly speaking, ever fully on duty in the way his superiors in the distant, brick-bound city of Strathbane understood the term. He was currently engaged in high-level community surveillance. This involved nursing a mug of filter coffee that was rapidly cooling, scratching the ears of his small, indeterminate terrier, Lugs, and staring vacantly out of the Rain Street window at the completely deserted waterfront street. Hamish was a tall, gangling man with fiery red hair that defied regulation cuts, and hazel eyes that often held a deceptive look of bovine stupidity. His uniform always seemed 2 sizes too big, hanging off his lean frame as if it belonged to a sturdier predecessor. To the untrained eye, he was a rustic simpleton, a man whose ambition stretched no further than his next pot of poached salmon. This was exactly how Hamish liked it. Ambition got you promoted. Promotion got you transferred to Strathbane, a place of concrete, paperwork, and actual crime. Hamish preferred Lochdubh, where the biggest crisis of the week was usually Mrs. Wellington at the post office overcharging tourists for stamps, or Callum MacGregor's sheep wandering onto the main road to lick the salt off the tarmac. He sighed, a sound that seemed to travel all the way up from his size 13 boots. He was contemplating the immense effort required to stand up and walk back to the police station, which doubled as his home, to check if his erratic electric stove might condescend to heat up a tin of stew for lunch. His existential ponderings were interrupted by the aggressive roar of an engine that didn't belong in the Highlands. A Range Rover, black and polished to such an obscene mirror shine that it seemed to repel the very rain, mounted the curb outside the hotel. It was a vehicle designed for Chelsea tractors, not single-track Scottish roads with passing places designated by sheep. "Oh dear," murmured Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, who was polishing a glass behind the bar with the air of a man perpetually expecting disaster. "Here comes trouble in expensive tweed." The door of the Range Rover swung open, and a pair of pristine chestnut leather walking boots emerged, stepping straight into a deep puddle of peaty water. A muffled curse, distinctly upper-crust English, drifted through the hotel's heavy oak door before it burst open. The man who entered carried the surrounding atmosphere with him like a personal weather system. He was large, florid-faced, and dressed in a brand-new Harris tweed suit that was far too loud and cost more than Hamish earned in 6 months. He smelled intensely of expensive cologne and entitlement. This was Crispin Delancey. He was a property developer from London who had recently purchased the Old Pier and the surrounding craggy headland known locally as the Watchman's Point. His arrival 3 weeks ago had been greeted by the villagers with the same enthusiasm they usually reserved for an outbreak of sheep scab. Delancey shook himself like a wet dog, spraying water onto the meticulously vacuumed carpet. He looked around the quiet lounge with undisguised contempt, his eyes sliding right over Hamish as if the policeman were a piece of unremarkable upholstery. "You there, barman!" Delancey barked, snapping his fingers at Mr. Johnson. "Coffee, large. And for God's sake, make it an oat milk flat white. None of that instant sludge I saw you serving the locals yesterday." Mr. Johnson bristled but maintained his professional veneer. "We have semi-skimmed or full fat, sir, and filter coffee." Delancey rolled his eyes toward the heavens. "Barbaric, absolutely barbaric. Fine, filter black, and bring me a menu. I suppose I have to eat something in this godforsaken backwater." He threw himself into a leather armchair near the fireplace, pulling out a slim silver laptop. He began typing furiously, the aggressive clack-clack-clack echoing through the quiet room like gunfire. Hamish shifted slightly, and Luggs let out a small, rusty yawn. The movement caught Delancey's eye. "Ah, the local constabulary," Delancey sneered, not looking up from his screen. "Hard at work, I see, keeping the armchairs safe from criminal elements?" Hamish blinked slowly. He adopted his best expression of dense rural confusion. "It is a very wet day, sir," he said in his soft, sibilant Highland lilt. "The criminals do not like the damp. It gives them the rheumatics." Delancey let out a sharp, barking laugh devoid of humour. "Marvellous. I'm building a multi-million-pound eco-luxury retreat on that headland, and my security is a man worried about burglars catching a cold. You lot are priceless." "Eco-luxury retreat," Hamish repeated, tasting the words as if they were sour milk. The village knew all about it. Delancey planned to bulldoze the remains of the historic granite watchtower on the point to build 20 glass-fronted pods for wealthy tourists who wanted to experience the rugged Highlands without actually having to get rugged. It was widely considered a desecration. "That's right, officer, whatever your name is," Delancey snapped, finally slamming his laptop shut. "Progress, jobs, money flowing into this stagnant little pond you call a village. You should be grateful. Instead of obstructing me with petty planning regulations and inciting the locals to vandalize my survey pegs." Hamish widened his eyes innocently. "Vandalize, sir? Oh, I am sure nobody in Lochdubh would do such a thing. Perhaps it was the deer. They rub their antlers on strange wood, you see." Delancey stood up, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of magenta. He loomed over Hamish, who remained slouching comfortably. "Don't play the village idiot with me," Delancey hissed. "I know you people hate me. I know you want me gone. But I am sinking a fortune into that headland, and I won't let a bunch of sheepshaggers and a lazy, incompetent policeman stop me. I'm bringing my own security up starting tomorrow. Real professionals. They won't be worried about the rain." He grabbed the coffee Mr. Johnson had nervously placed on the table, took a scalding gulp, grimaced, and threw a £20 note onto the table before storming out. The heavy door slammed behind him, leaving a vacuum of silence and the lingering scent of expensive aftershave fighting with the smell of damp tweed. Hamish picked up his own cold coffee and finished it. "A charmer, isn't he?" Mr. Johnson said, collecting the £20 note with a shaking hand. "He's going to cause real trouble, Hamish. The fishermen are up in arms about him closing off access to the Old Pier, and old Angus is threatening to get his shotgun if they touch the watchtower ruins." "Aye," Hamish agreed softly, scratching Luggs behind the ears. The dog groaned in appreciation. "He is a man in a terrible hurry to make enemies. It is a dangerous thing to be in the Highlands, Mr. Johnson. The mountains have a way of slowing people down." Hamish stared out the window again. The rain had eased slightly, revealing the dark, jagged silhouette of the Watchman's Point jutting out into the turbulent grey loch. It looked less like a scenic viewpoint today, and more like a crooked finger beckoning something unpleasant toward the shore. Hamish had a sudden, uncomfortable itch between his shoulder blades, a feeling he usually only got right before DCI Blair shouted at him. He stood up, stretching his long limbs. "Come along, Luggs. Let us go and see if the stove is in a cooperative mood. I feel a need for something warm in my stomach." Hamish didn't know it yet, but it would be the last peaceful meal he would have for quite some time. The following morning did not so much break as it did seep through the curtains of the Lochdubh police station in a sickly shade of grey. Hamish Macbeth lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of a leak in the guttering, contemplating the unfairness of the universe. He had spent a portion of the night engaged in what he preferred to call resource management, which involved a quiet trip to the river and the successful acquisition of a silver-sided salmon, and his legs ached with a pleasant, illicit weariness. He was just drifting into a dream involving a bottomless pot of coffee and a fireplace that never smoked, when a frantic pounding began at his front door. It wasn't the polite, tentative knock of a tourist asking for directions. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a Highlander bearing bad news. Luggs let out a sharp, annoyed bark and jumped off the bed. Hamish groaned, pulling the duvet over his head. "Go away," he muttered to the empty room. "The police station is closed for essential maintenance of the soul." The pounding continued, followed by a voice shouting through the letterbox. "Hamish! Hamish, man, wake up! There's a horror down at the Old Pier. A terrible thing altogether." Hamish sighed, realizing the resource management of the previous night was likely to be his only victory for the day. He climbed out of bed, his long, pale legs shivering in the morning chill. He pulled on a pair of wrinkled trousers, a thick woolen jumper that smelled faintly of peat smoke, and his boots, which he didn't bother to lace up properly. He looked, as he usually did, like a man who had been tossed out of a moving wardrobe. He opened the door to find Archie McLean, a local fisherman whose face was a map of broken veins and salt-crusted wrinkles. Archie was gasping for air, his yellow oilskins slick with mist. "It's the Englishman, Hamish," Archie wheezed, pointing a shaking finger toward the lock. "Delancey, he's at the pier, and he's not looking well, not well at all." "Is he shouting at someone?" Hamish asked hopefully. "Perhaps he just needs a bit of a lie-down." "He's having a lie-down he'll not be getting up from," Archie said grimly. Hamish's stomach gave a small, traitorous rumble. He had been looking forward to a breakfast of fresh eggs and his poached salmon. Now he was looking forward to a day of DCI Blair's shouting and the cold wind of the pier. He grabbed his peaked cap, which sat askew on his messy hair, and whistled for Luggs. The walk to the Old Pier was conducted in a silence broken only by the squelch of their boots. The thick sea mist, had rolled in off the Minch, swallowing the world. The mountains were gone, the village was a collection of ghostly shapes. Only the mournful cry of a distant gull suggested that life existed beyond the white veil. As they reached the granite edge of the Old Pier, the scene emerged from the mist like a macabre stage set. Crispin Delancey was indeed at the pier, but he was no longer the arrogant king of his eco-luxury empire. He was slumped against one of the heavy iron mooring bollards. In a touch of dark, humiliating irony, he had been bound to the post using his own neon-orange danger construction site tape. The bright plastic ribbon was wound round and round his expensive tweed suit, making him look like a grotesque, oversized parcel that had been rejected by the post office. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, his mouth open as if he were still trying to demand a flat white with oat milk. His pristine chestnut boots were caked in thick Black Harbour mud. But the most bizarre detail was the crown. Someone had placed a rusted, seaweed-draped lobster pot over his head like a cage. Luggs trotted up to the body, gave it a disinterested sniff, and promptly lifted a leg against the mooring post. "Luggs, have some respect for the deceased," Hamish scolded mildly, though his eyes were sharp and moving rapidly. He knelt by the body, his joints complaining. He didn't touch anything, he just looked. He noticed the way the mud was smeared on the boots, the specific way the knots in the orange tape were tied, clumsy but firm, and the fact that Delancey's expensive silver watch was still on his wrist. This wasn't a robbery. "Well," Hamish sighed, standing up and looking out at the grey, indifferent water. "He wanted to leave his mark on Lochdubh. I suppose he's managed it." "What are you going to do, Hamish?" Archie asked, hovering several feet away. Hamish looked at the lobster pot, then at the orange tape, and finally at his own unlaced boots. He felt a profound sense of irritation. This murder was untidy, it was flamboyant. Worst of all, it was the sort of crime that brought the heavy hand of Strathbane down upon the village. "I am going to go back to the station," Hamish said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I am going to make a very large pot of coffee, and then, may God help us all, I am going to pick up the telephone and call Detective Chief Inspector Blair." He looked at the body one last time. Beneath the lazy mask, Hamish's mind was already cataloguing the locals who owned lobster pots, and the exact time the tide would have brought Delancey's killer to the pier. The peace of Lochdubh hadn't just been shattered, It had been wrapped in plastic and crowned with a cage. The peace of the Highlands was not merely broken, it was obliterated by the arrival of the Strathbane Criminal Investigation Department. The silence of the misty morning was replaced by the discordant wail of sirens that echoed off the surrounding crags, like the cries of tormented banshees. 3 white police cruisers and a forensic van skidded onto the gravel of the Old Pier, their tyres spitting stones with unnecessary aggression. Detective Chief Inspector Cyril Blair emerged from the lead car like a pressure cooker reaching its limit. He was a man whose blood pressure seemed to be a permanent resident in the danger zone, with a face the colour of an overripe plum and a neck that had long ago surrendered its territory to his shirt collar. He hated the Highlands, he hated the rain, and he held a particular burning loathing for PC Hamish Macbeth. "Macbeth!" Blair roared before his feet had even fully cleared the car. He slipped on a patch of wet seaweed, his arms windmilling wildly before he steadied himself with a snarl. "You great lanky streak of Highland misery, I might have known I'd find you standing around doing nothing while a prominent citizen is murdered on your doorstep." Hamish, who was currently leaning against a rusted winch with the studied nonchalance of a man waiting for a bus, touched the brim of his cap. "Good morning to you, sir. It is a grand bracing morning, is it not? Don't you grand morning me, you ginger-haired simpleton." Blair stomped toward the body, his expensive city shoes instantly ruined by the harbour muck. He stopped dead, staring at the orange-taped figure of Crispin Delancey and the lobster pot crown. Behind him, his sycophantic sidekicks, Detectives Anderson and McNabb, hovered with notebooks at the ready, looking like 2 crows anticipating a feast. "Good God," Blair muttered, his eyes bulging. "What in the name of the Kirk is this? It's a circus act." "It is a lobster pot, sir," Hamish offered helpfully. "A fine one, too. Looks like it belongs to the McLean brothers, though the weave is a bit loose on the side." Blair turned on him, his teeth bared. "I don't care about the provenance of the wickerwork, Macbeth. This is a mockery, a calculated insult to the victim and the police force. This Delancey was a man of influence. He had friends in the Scottish office. And look at him. He looks like a failed Christmas hamper." Blair circled the body, his mind already churning with a kind of detective's intuition that had seen him arrest more innocent people than actual criminals over the last decade. He ignored the forensic team as they began to set up their tapes, stepping over a crucial set of footprints in his haste to reach a conclusion. "It's obvious," Blair announced, clapping his hands together. "It's a political statement, an act of domestic terrorism by these local Luddites who didn't want the development. It's an environmentalist hit, or one of those surly fishermen. They've tied him up with his own tape to show their irony. It's a classic case of rural thuggery." "The knots are very interesting, sir," Hamish murmured, peering over Blair's shoulder. "They are not sailors' knots. They are more like the kind of thing a man might use to tie a bundle of newspapers. Very domestic." Blair spun around, his face inches from Hamish's. The smell of stale cigarettes and peppermint breath mints washed over the constable. "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job, Macbeth? You who couldn't find a cow in a telephone booth. You're a village bobby. Your job is to keep the sheep off the road and stay out of the way of the grown-ups." "Oh, absolutely, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, syrupy Highland drawl that suggested a profound lack of intellect. "I am just a simple man, sir. My brain is not suited for the high-level thinking of the CID. It is quite a muddle in there, to be sure." "Too right it is," Blair sneered. He turned back to Anderson and McNabb. "Right, you two. I want a list of every person in this village who's ever signed a petition against that pier development. I want the owners of every boat in the harbour questioned, and find out which of these togters is missing a lobster pot. We'll have someone in a cell by tea time." He pointed a stubby finger at Hamish. "As for you, Macbeth, you can stay here and guard the perimeter. Don't touch anything. Don't talk to anyone. In fact, try not to breathe too loudly. You might contaminate the evidence with your sheer incompetence. Get lost." "As you wish, sir," Hamish said, hiding a small smile. "I shall go and guard the village end of the pier, from a distance, a very long distance." Hamish whistled for lugs and began to saunter away toward the village. Blair's arrogance was, as always, a gift. By dismissing Hamish, the DCI had unwittingly given him the freedom of the parish, while Blair and his team spent the day bullying the local fishermen and making enemies of the very people who might have seen something. Hamish would be doing the real work. He knew that in Lochdubh, the truth was never found in a forensic kit or an interrogation room. It was found in the steam rising from a teacup and the whispers shared over the garden fence. "Come, lugs," Hamish whispered as they cleared the police tape. "Let us go and see if Mrs. Wellington has heard anything. I believe it is time for a very long, very informative cup of tea." The village of Lochdubh was in a state of high Victorian melodrama. While DCI Blair was busy shouting at the gulls and scaring the local fish, the real investigation was happening in the fragrant, heated interior of the village post office and general stores. Hamish Macbeth, having secured the perimeter by walking exactly half a mile away from the crime scene, leaned his elbows on the counter. Luggs sat patiently by his boots, looking up at Mrs. Wellington with soulful, manipulative eyes. Mrs. Wellington, the postmistress and unofficial arbiter of Lochdubh's moral standards, was currently vibrating with the kind of indignant energy that usually preceded a very long story. "It is a dark day, Hamish," she said, though her eyes sparkled with the grim satisfaction of being at the centre of a scandal. She reached under the counter and produced a tin of shortbread. "Dreadful. And that man from the city, that Inspector Blair, he had the gall to tell me to shut up and stay indoors. To me, in my own shop. He is a very pressured man, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said softly, his hand drifting toward the shortbread. "A man of great city burdens. He does not understand the delicate nature of a Highland greeting." "He's a pig-headed brute," she corrected. "He was in here 10 minutes ago, demanding to know who owned the lobster pot. I told him every man from here to Ullapool owns a lobster pot, and if he wanted to arrest a wicker basket, he was welcome to try." Hamish chuckled, a low, easy sound. "And what about Mr. Delancey? A tragic end for a man with so many plans." Mrs. Wellington leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that could have been heard in the next county. "Plans? He had more plans than sense, Hamish, but it wasn't just the pier. Did you know he'd been receiving letters? Not the electronic kind, real letters. Thick envelopes, postmarked from London but addressed in a hand that looked like a spider had dipped its legs in ink and crawled across the paper." Hamish paused, a half-eaten biscuit near his lips. "Is that so? And would you happen to have noticed if he was upset by them?" "Upset? He was livid. He came in here last Tuesday to post a reply, recorded delivery, mind you, and he was sweating like a man who'd seen a ghost. He was shouting into that mobile phone of his about not being bled dry and knowing where the bodies were buried. Metaphorically speaking, I assume." "One would hope," Hamish murmured. "And the recipient of this recorded delivery? A firm of solicitors in London, but the return address on the letters coming to him, they were local, Hamish, or at least they were being hand-delivered. No stamps, just tucked into the box at the old schoolhouse he was renting." Hamish took a slow sip of the tea Mrs. Wellington had provided. This was the mooching phase of his work, and it was far more productive than Blair's forensic dusting. Blair looked for fingerprints. Hamish looked for friction. "And what of the newcomer at the hotel?" Hamish asked. "The young lady who arrived 2 days ago. The one with the very large sunglasses and the very small car. Miss Arabella Thorne," Mrs. Wellington sniffed, "claims to be a lifestyle consultant. I call it being paid to be decorative. She and Mr. Delancey had a shouting match in the car park of the hotel on Sunday. Something about a contractual obligation and the price of silence. She didn't look like a consultant then. She looked like a woman who wanted to push him off a cliff." Hamish filed Arabella Thorne and price of silence into the sharp, organised part of his brain that lived behind the lazy exterior. He stood up, brushing crumbs from his jumper. "I suppose I should go and see if the Patel family has seen anything from the curry shop," Hamish said. "Mr. Patel has a very good view of the road leading to the pier, and a very good line in spicy pakora," Mrs. Wellington added pointedly. "That too," Hamish agreed. He spent the next hour drifting through the village like a slow-moving fog. He spoke to Mr. Patel, who revealed that Delancey had been seen walking toward the pier late at night, not with a surveyor, but with a local. A man Mr. Patel couldn't quite identify in the dark, but who walked with a pronounced heavy limp. He spoke to the minister's wife, who mentioned that the Watchman ruins weren't just a pile of stones to everyone. Apparently the local historical society, which consisted entirely of Old Angus, and a very angry retired school teacher, had discovered that the tower sat on a pre-Christian burial site. Delancey had laughed in their faces when they asked him to halt construction. By the time Hamish reached the end of the main street, he knew three things DCI Blair did not. Delancey was being blackmailed, he was fighting with a lifestyle consultant over money, and he had recently insulted the most superstitious man in the village. As he turned back toward his station, he saw Blair's car roar past, likely heading to arrest a confused shepherd. Hamish sighed. The secrets of Lochdubh were like the peat bogs, soft on the surface, but deep, dark, and very good at swallowing things whole. "Now, lugs," Hamish whispered, "we have the what and a bit of the why. Now we just need to see how the ladies of the great house feel about all this. If the village of Lochdubh was the heart of the parish, Tommel Castle was its distant aristocratic brain. The ancestral home of the Halbert and Smythes sat perched on a rise, looking down upon the loch with a chilly, grey-eyed indifference. To Hamish Macbeth, the castle was a place of painful beauty, partly because of its architecture, but mostly because of Priscilla Halbert and Smythe. Hamish trudged up the long winding drive, his boots crunching on the pristine gravel. The rain had turned back into a thin, clinging mist that hung in the ancient rhododendrons. Lugs trotted ahead, his tail held high, clearly feeling that a castle was a more appropriate setting for a dog of his hidden talents than a muddy pier. Hamish felt his usual surge of inadequacy. He was a policeman with a small salary, a leaky roof, and a tendency to poach his own dinner. Priscilla was the daughter of a baronet, a woman of grace, education, and a wardrobe that didn't include a single item of moth-eaten wool. In the past, they had danced a delicate, frustrated tango of almosts, and seeing her always left Hamish feeling like a stray dog looking through a butcher's window. He found her in the morning room, which was filled with the scent of beeswax and expensive lilies. Priscilla was seated by a tall window, a book in her lap, looking as cool and composed as a marble statue. When she saw Hamish, a small, genuine smile touched her lips, the kind of smile that always made Hamish's knees feel momentarily like porridge. "Hamish," she said, her voice like silk, "I heard the news." "I assume the lobster pot was the talk of the breakfast table at the hotel?" "It has caused a bit of a stir, Priscilla," Hamish admitted, taking the seat she offered and trying not to look at his muddy boots on the Persian rug. "DCI Blair is currently trying to arrest the entire fishing fleet. He thinks it's a peasant revolt." Priscilla laughed, a light, musical sound. Poor Inspector Blair. He never did understand that in the Highlands, a peasant revolt usually just involves moving a fence post 6 inches to the left every night for a year. She poured him a cup of Earl Grey. Hamish took it, though he would have preferred a mug of strong, stewed tea that could dissolve a spoon. "I came to ask you about the Sassenach set," Hamish said, dropping the lazy act. Priscilla was one of the few people he didn't need to deceive. This Delancey man. He was making a lot of noise about his eco-luxury plans. But Mrs. Wellington says he was receiving letters that made him sweat. And there's a girl, an Arabella Thorne. Priscilla's expression sharpened. She set her cup down with a precise clink. Arabella Thorne is not a lifestyle consultant, Hamish. She's a professional vulture. She specializes in image management for men who have more money than reputation. I met her at a gallery opening in London last year. She was attached to a Russian oligarch who disappeared shortly after his bank accounts were emptied. Is that so? Hamish leaned forward. And Delancey? Was he as rich as he looked? Priscilla shook her head. That's the interesting part. My father had some business dealings with the firm financing the Pier project. He heard whispers that the funding had been pulled weeks ago. Delancey was a man of straw, Hamish. He was desperately trying to keep the project alive to avoid a total collapse of his other interests. If he couldn't break ground on the Watchman's Point by the end of the month, he was ruined. So, Hamish mused, he was a man with no money, a professional blackmailer for a consultant, and he was threatening to bulldoze a local burial site. He was essentially juggling grenades. And one of them went off, Priscilla added quietly. But there's something else. Yesterday, before he died, I saw him near the old churchyard. He was talking to a man in a very heated way. I couldn't hear what was said, but the other man was wearing a very distinctive coat, a heavy waxed barber that had seen better days, and he walked with a limp. Hamish felt the itch between his shoulder blades again. A limp, you say? Mr. Patel mentioned a man with a limp. Did you see his face? No, Priscilla sighed. He had his hood up. But Hamish, be careful. This doesn't feel like a village squabble over a lobster pot. There was a look in Delancey's eyes, not anger, but genuine cold terror. He wasn't afraid of the locals. He was afraid of whatever was in those letters. Hamish stood up, his mind whirling. The romantic complication was, as always, complicated. Priscilla provided the clarity he lacked, but her world remained forever out of reach. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. "Thank you, Priscilla," he said softly. "You have been more help than the entire CID combined." "Stay for lunch, Hamish?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "The cook has made a very fine venison pie." Hamish looked at her, then at the elegant, silent room. He thought of his own cold station, the waiting silence of the village and the dark secret hidden under a lobster pot. "I cannot, Priscilla," he said, and for once he didn't sound lazy at all. "I have a man with a limp to find, and a vulture to interview. And if I stay here too long, I might start thinking I belong here, and we both know I don't." He turned and walked out, leaving Priscilla standing by the window. As he descended the drive, the Highland wind bit through his jumper, and Hamish Macbeth felt every bit the lonely Highland policeman he was. The village square of Lochdubh was currently playing host to a scene of such chaotic indignity that it could only have been orchestrated by DCI Blair. The mist had lifted just enough to reveal a crowd of locals gathered in a grim semicircle around the back of a police van. In the centre of the drama was old Angus MacGregor, a man whose face resembled a shriveled walnut and whose temperament was generally compared to that of a badger with a toothache. Blair was red-faced, his chest puffed out like a territorial pigeon. He was holding aloft a rusty, seaweed-encrusted lobster pot as if it were the crown jewels. "Got him!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the grocery store. "I told you, Macbeth! I told you it was one of these local savages. We found the murder weapon, or the headgear at least, hidden in his shed, along with a double-barreled shotgun that hasn't seen a license since the reign of Queen Victoria." Angus, whose hands were cuffed behind his back, let out a string of Gaelic curses that sounded like gravel being turned in a cement mixer. "I told ye great fat bladder of lard. That pot's been in the shed since the Great War. It's got no bottom. And that shotgun is for the crows." "Save it for the sheriff," Blair sneered, shoving Angus toward the open doors of the van. "You threatened Delancey in public. You hated his guts. You've got the limp that witnesses saw at the pier. It's an open and shut case. Anderson, McNabb, get him in the back. I have a press release to dictate." Hamish, who had been watching from the periphery with Lugg sitting dutifully at his side, stepped forward. He walked with a slow, wandering gait, as if he had accidentally stumbled into the crime scene while looking for a lost sheep. "Oh, well done, sir," Hamish said, his voice dripping with a syrupy, thick Highland accent. "A marvellous bit of detective work. To find a lobster pot in a fisherman's shed, why, it's like finding a bottle in a brewery. Truly inspired. Blair spun around, his eyes narrowing. Watch it, Macbeth. I've no time for your sarcasm. I've caught your killer. You should be thanking me for cleaning up your mess. Oh, I am, sir, I am, Hamish said, tilting his head and looking at Angus's boots. It is just, well, it is a small thing, really. Not worth mentioning to a man of your vast experience. What? Blair snapped. Out with it, you ginger-haired oaf. Well, Hamish began, scratching his chin thoughtfully. You mentioned the limp, sir. Poor old Angus here does indeed have a terrible limp. His left hip was crushed by a runaway tractor back in '82. He drags that left leg like a sack of coal. So? Blair barked. The witness said the man at the pier had a limp. Aye, Hamish said softly. But the tracks at the pier, sir, the ones in that thick black harbour mud, they showed a very deep dragging print from the right foot. A right-legged limp is a very different thing from a left-legged one, wouldn't you say? It's a bit like trying to put a left-handed glove on a right hand. It doesn't fit the rhythm of the man. The crowd went silent. Blair looked down at Angus's feet, then back at Hamish. His face shifted from magenta to a dangerous shade of purple. Footprints? You're talking about footprints in the mud? Blair scoffed, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. The forensics team didn't report any right-legged prints. Perhaps they were looking for DNA and laser beams, sir, Hamish said innocently. I just used my eyes. And there is the matter of the mud itself. You see, Delancey's boots were covered in that black stinking silt from the Old Pier, but look at Angus's boots. They're covered in red peaty clay from the hillside. If he'd been down at the pier last night, tying a man up in orange tape, he'd have that black muck in every stitch of his leather. And Angus, as everyone knows, is too lazy to wash his boots. He hasn't washed them since the coronation. It's true, shouted Mrs. Wellington from the crowd. He brings half the hillside into my shop every morning. Hamish reached down and picked up a small, discarded piece of neon-orange tape that had fallen from Blair's evidence bag. He turned it over in his fingers. And then there is the matter of the knots, sir, Hamish continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Angus is a fisherman. He knows a bowline, a clove hitch, and a sheep shank. He could tie a knot in his sleep that wouldn't slip in a hurricane. But the man who tied up Mr. Delancey, well, he used granny knots, clumsy domestic things. The kind of knots a man uses when he's in a great hurry and hasn't handled a rope in his life. Blair looked at the lobster pot, then at the orange tape, then at the scowling, mud-caked old man in handcuffs. The open and shut case was beginning to creak ominously. This is nonsense, Blair roared, though he signalled Anderson to hold off on closing the van doors. The limp, the threats, the pot, it's all here. It is a very pretty picture, sir, Hamish agreed, if you like pictures that are upside down, but I fear if you take Angus to Strathbane, the lawyers will have a field day with the wrong-legged murderer. It might make the CID look, well, a bit foolish. Blair's ego was a fragile thing, and the prospect of looking foolish in Strathbane was the only thing he feared more than Hamish Macbeth. He glared at Angus, then at Hamish, his breath coming in ragged, angry hitches. Fine, Blair spat. Unlock him. But if I find out you're protecting one of your own, Macbeth, I'll have your badge for breakfast. Anderson, McNabb, back to the hotel. We're going to grill that lifestyle girl again. If it wasn't the local loony, it's the London vulture. As the police van roared away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a very disgruntled Angus McGregor, Hamish stood quietly in the square. He had saved Angus, but he hadn't found the killer. He looked down at Lugs. The right leg, Lugs, Hamish whispered. Someone who wants to look like a local but doesn't know the first thing about the mud or the knots. Someone who is playing a part. He looked toward the hotel. The red herring had been cleared away, leaving something much more calculated and much darker beneath the surface. The fire in the police station's small iron stove was performing its usual trick of producing a great deal of smoke and very little heat. Hamish Macbeth sat on a low stool, staring into the flickering orange embers while lugs snored rhythmically at his feet. A pot of greyish-looking mutton stew sat on top of the stove, occasionally emitting a lonely bubble. Hamish was not thinking about the stew. He was thinking about handwriting, boots, and the peculiar nature of Highland secrets. Earlier that afternoon, Blair had triumphantly hauled Arabella Thorne into the station for a formal interview, which mostly consisted of Blair shouting and Arabella demanding a lawyer, a gin and tonic, and a heater in that order. The city detectives were convinced she had killed Delancey for his insurance or his remaining assets. It was a city motive, neat, greedy, and entirely wrong. "It is too noisy, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "The death of a man like Delancey should not be this noisy." He reached for a small stack of papers he had borrowed from the hotel's wastepaper basket while Mr. Johnson was busy placating a group of distressed tourists. Among the discarded receipts and wine lists was a handwritten note, a draft of the daily specials. The handwriting was cramped, precise, and looked remarkably like a spider had dipped its legs in ink and crawled across the page. It was the same handwriting Mrs. Wellington had described on the letters that had made Delancey sweat. Hamish leaned back, the wooden chair creaking in protest. Mr. Johnson, the manager of the Lochdubh Hotel, was the quintessential invisible man. He was the backdrop to every village drama, the silent provider of tea and sympathy, the man who knew everyone's business because he was the one pouring the drinks. He was also a man who walked with the practiced, fluid grace of a career servant. Until today. Hamish recalled the way Johnson had moved when he brought the coffee to Delancey in Section 1. He had been nimble. But this afternoon, when Hamish had mooched a quick cup of tea at the bar, Johnson had favoured his right side. He had bumped into the corner of the bar, a small wince flickering across his usually impassive face, a right-legged limp. A fall on the slippery, seaweed-covered stones of the Old Pier would certainly account for a bruised hip. But why would a mild-mannered hotel manager tie a property developer to a post with neon tape and crown him with a lobster pot? Hamish stood up and walked to the window. The mist had returned, turning the loch into a world of ghosts. He thought about what Priscilla had said, that Delancey was a man of straw, a failure desperately clinging to the Watchman's Point project. And he thought about the ruins themselves. "It is not about the money, Lugs," Hamish said, his voice a low vibration in the small room. "It is about the shame." He remembered a story, one of those long, winding Highland tales old Angus had told him years ago over a dram of illicit whiskey. It was a story about the great house, the Halbert and Smythes of 3 generations ago, and a young footman who had been dismissed without a character for a grave indiscretion involving a visiting lady's jewellery. The footman had vanished, but the shame had lingered like a stain on his family, a family of local crofters named Johnston. Delancey, in his aggressive research for the eco-luxury project, hadn't just been looking at soil samples. He'd been digging into the history of the land and the people on it. He was a man who looked for leverage. What if Delancey had discovered that Mr. Johnson, the respectable manager of the village's finest hotel, was actually the grandson of that disgraced footman? Or worse, what if the jewellery hadn't been stolen at all, but given as a gift, and the indiscretion was a bloodline that would make the current manager a rightful, if illegitimate, heir to a portion of the very land Delancey wanted to develop? In a village like Lochdubh, where your grandfather's reputation was as current as yesterday's news, such a revelation wouldn't just be an embarrassment, it would be a social execution. Johnson would lose his job, his standing, and his quiet, carefully constructed life. Delancey hadn't been being blackmailed. He had been the one doing the squeezing. He was forcing Johnson to use his position to influence the local council, or perhaps to provide the recorded delivery letters that would sign over ancient rights. Johnson hadn't killed for wealth. He had killed to remain invisible. He had tied Delancey up in that orange tape and crowned him with a lobster pot as a final, desperate act of mockery, a peasant's revenge against the man who had tried to pull him out of his comfortable shadow. "The granny knots," Hamish murmured. "The knots of a man who spends his life tying parcels and polishing silver, not hauling nets." He looked at the bubbling stew. He wasn't hungry anymore. He knew who, and he knew why. Now he just had to prove it without DCI Blair noticing that the useless peasant had solved the case before the forensics had even dried. "I think," Hamish said, reaching for his cap, "it is time to set a very small, very Highland trap." The bar of the Lochdubh Hotel was thick with the scent of stale hops, wood smoke, and the mounting desperation of DCI Blair. The inspector was currently 4 whiskies deep into a fit of pique, slumped in a wing-back chair, while his subordinates, Anderson and MacNab, looked on with the weary expressions of men who had spent the afternoon being shouted at in a variety of Highland locations. Hamish Macbeth wandered in, looking even more dishevelled than usual. He was carrying a damp burlap sack and had a look of profound, vacuous concentration on his face. Lugs followed at his heels, his tail drooping with a theatrical fatigue that matched his master's. "You again," Blair groaned, not even bothering to look up from his glass. "I thought I told you to go and patrol a peat bog. Why aren't you out arresting the person who actually did this?" "I was just doing a bit of administrative tidying, sir," Hamish said, his voice a soft, apologetic whistle. He leaned heavily against the bar, where Mr. Johnson was fastidiously polishing a silver tray. The manager's movements were precise, but Hamish noticed a rhythmic hitch in his gait, a subtle right-sided hesitation that spoke of a bruised hip and a long night on slippery stones. "Administrative tidying?" Blair sneered. "Is that what you call poaching?" "Oh no, sir. I was down at the Old Pier. You see, the forensics people, they are very thorough with the big things," Hamish said, leaning in as if sharing a great secret. "But they are not so good with the small soggy things. I found something in the silt under the pilings, just as the tide was turning." Mr. Johnson's polishing slowed. The screech of the cloth against the silver was the only sound in the room. "And what," Blair sighed, "did your hee-haw detective skills uncover?" "A letter, sir," Hamish said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a damp, crumpled envelope, carefully encased in a clear plastic evidence bag. Through the plastic, one could see the smudged, spidery handwriting that Mrs. Wellington had described. It was tucked into a crevice in the granite. It must have fallen from Mr. Delancey's pocket during the unpleasantness. Blair sat up, his eyes widening. "A letter? Give it here." Hamish pulled it back slightly, a look of rustic concern on his face. "Oh, I cannot do that just yet, sir. It is soaking wet. If we open it now, the ink will run like a startled deer. I've been told by the schoolmaster, who is a very learned man, that it needs to be dried slowly under a low heat to preserve the writing. I was going to take it back to the station and put it by the stove tonight." "Don't be a fool, Macbeth," Blair barked, reaching for the bag. "That's evidence. It belongs in a proper lab. The lab van has already gone back to Strathbane, sir," Hamish reminded him gently. "And the ink is very faint. If it dries too fast, it'll be nothing but a grey smudge. If I keep it by my peat fire, it should be readable by dawn. It seems to be a confession of sorts. Or at least a name." Hamish didn't look at Mr. Johnson, but he could feel the man's gaze boring into the side of his head. The manager's knuckles were white as they gripped the silver tray. "Fine," Blair spat, waving a hand dismissively. "Keep your soggy scrap of paper. I'll be at the station at first light, and if that letter isn't readable, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of the Kessock Bridge for the next 10 years. I shall guard it with my life, sir," Hamish promised. He turned to Mr. Johnson. "A small glass of milk for the dog, Mr. Johnson?" "He is very thirsty after all that digging in the mud, of course, Macbeth," Johnson said, his voice tight and unnervingly thin. He reached for a glass, his right leg giving a sharp, involuntary twitch as he shifted his weight. Hamish finished his business and sauntered out of the hotel, the plastic bag tucked prominently into his breast pocket. As he stepped out into the cold, drizzling night, the lazy expression vanished, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. "He bit. Lugs," Hamish whispered, the Highland wind whipping his red hair. The man is terrified of what his grandfather's ghost might say in that letter. Of course, the envelope was empty. It was a blank sheet of paper Hamish had dipped in the loch and addressed himself using a spindly, mimicking hand. But to a man with a guilty conscience and a secret to hide, it was a death warrant. Hamish didn't go back to the police station. Instead, he made a wide circuit through the back gardens, moving with the silent, predatory grace of the poacher he was. He looped back toward the Old Pier, the place where the Watchman ruins stood like jagged teeth against the night sky. He knew that Johnson couldn't afford to wait until dawn. The manager would have to get that letter before it dried, before the name Johnston or the secret of the bloodline was revealed to the world. And there was only one place a man like Johnson would go to intercept a policeman carrying a confession: the dark, lonely stretch of road between the hotel and the station, right by the Old Pier where the shadows were deepest. Hamish settled into a thicket of gorse overlooking the pier road. He pulled his coat tight, checked his heavy regulation flashlight, and waited. The trap was set. The bait was the killer's own shame, and in the Highlands, the only thing that moved faster than gossip was a man trying to outrun his past. The night was as black as a Highland widow's weeds. Out on the loch, the water slapped against the granite pilings of the Old Pier with a wet, rhythmic thud, the sound of a giant heartbeat slowing down. Hamish Macbeth crouched low in the gorse, his long limbs folded like a deck chair. Beside him, Lugs was a silent shadow, his ears pricked toward the road. Hamish wasn't at the station. He had left a lamp burning in his window and a pile of old newspapers stuffed into his uniform jacket on the armchair to suggest a sleeping presence. He knew that, if Mr. Johnson was coming for the letter, he wouldn't risk entering the station through the front door. He would wait for Hamish to move the evidence, or he would try to catch him on the path. A sound broke the stillness, the rhythmic scuff hitch of a man favouring one leg. Through the veil of drizzle, a figure emerged. It was Mr. Johnson, but not the man who polished silver with a deferential smile. He was wearing a heavy, dark oilskin that made him look broader, more menacing. He wasn't heading for the station. He was heading for the Old Pier. He stopped by the very bollard where Delancey had been found, looking around with a frantic, bird-like intensity. Hamish stood up slowly, the gorse clawing at his trousers. "It is a cold night for a stroll, Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the damp air, "especially with a hip that's been giving you such trouble." Johnson spun around, his face a pale oval in the gloom. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. In his hand he wasn't carrying a gun, but a heavy, brass-headed fireplace poker, a solid domestic weapon from the hotel lounge. "Macbeth," Johnson hissed, his voice trembling, "give me the letter. I know you have it on you. I saw you put it in your pocket." "The letter is a fake, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, stepping out onto the road. He kept his hands visible, his heavy flashlight unlit in his left hand. There was no letter in the silt. There was only the ghost of a secret that you've been carrying since you were a boy. Johnson took a step forward, his limp more pronounced now that he wasn't trying to hide it. "You don't understand. That man, that London parasite," he found out. He went through the old parish records. He found the letters my grandfather wrote to the Halbert and Smythes. He was going to put it all in the papers. The eco-luxury man revealing the secret bastard of the Highlands. He laughed at me, Macbeth. He said I was a relic and that my family's shame was the only thing I truly owned, so you decided to crown him with a lobster pot, Hamish said softly, to show him what a real Highland relic looks like. He was going to destroy me, Johnson shouted, the sound swallowed by the mist. 30 years I've spent building a life here. 30 years of being the respectable Mr. Johnson. I couldn't let him turn me back into the grandson of a thief and a failure. He wasn't a thief, was he? Hamish asked, moving closer. The jewellery was a gift. Your grandfather was a man who loved above his station, and the shame was the only way the great house could cover the truth. Delancey didn't just threaten your job, he threatened the one bit of pride you had, the idea that your family was wronged. Johnson's face contorted. The brass poker caught a stray glint of light from the village lamps. Give me the paper, Macbeth. I won't go to jail for a man like him. I'll say I found you here. That you fell. He lunged. For a man with a limp, he was surprisingly fast, driven by the frantic energy of the cornered. He swung the heavy poker toward Hamish's head. Hamish didn't move like a lazy man. He moved with the coordinated grace of a man who spent his nights leaping over peat hags and dodging bailiffs. He ducked the swing, the brass head whistling past his ear, and stepped into Johnson's personal space. He didn't punch. He used his superior height and reach to wrap his long arms around the smaller man in a crushing bear hug. That is enough, Mr. Johnson, Hamish grunted as they hit the wet gravel together. Lugs began to bark furiously, circling the wrestling men. Johnson struggled, his boots kicking uselessly at the mud. But Hamish was like a coil of rusted wire, thin but impossible to break. He twisted the poker out of the manager's hand and pinned him to the ground. The granny knots, Mr. Johnson, Hamish panted, his face inches from the other man's. You should have asked a fisherman, and you should never have worn your hotel boots to a murder. The black silt of the pier is very unforgiving. Johnson suddenly went limp. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a low, broken sobbing that was more pathetic than frightening. Hamish let go of his arms but stayed close, his heart hammering against his ribs. It is over now, Hamish said, his voice returning to its soft, sibilant lilt. The secret is out, but it is not the shame you think it is. It is just a sad old story, and a very messy murder. He reached for his handcuffs, the cold steel clicking into place. As he stood up, pulling the shivering hotel manager with him, Hamish looked out at the loch. He felt no triumph, only a profound, weary sadness. Another life ruined, another peace shattered, and the inevitable arrival of DCI Blair to take the credit and shout at the remains. Come, lugs, Hamish sighed. Let us go and find the inspector. I believe he is still at the bar waiting for a miracle. The lounge of the Lochdubh Hotel was thick with the blue haze of DCI Blair's cheap cigars and the heavy electric silence of a man whose career felt like it was spinning its wheels in Highland peat. Blair was slumped in his chair, staring at the bottom of a glass of malt, while Anderson and MacNab stood by the fireplace, looking as if they were trying to blend into the wallpaper. The heavy oak door swung open, letting in a swirl of mist and the sharp, salt-tangled scent of the loch. PC Hamish Macbeth entered, looking more like a drowned scarecrow than a representative of the law. He was dripping water onto the rug, and his red hair was plastered to his forehead in wild, wet spikes. Behind him, looking utterly shattered and still in handcuffs, was Mr. Johnson. Blair looked up, his eyes bloodshot and narrowing. What is this, Macbeth? Have you arrested the barman for overcharging you for a sandwich? I told you I wanted the killer, not the hospitality staff. Hamish adopted his most vacant, wide-eyed expression of rural bewilderment. He wiped a drop of rain from his nose and sighed with a sound like a leaking bellows. Oh no, sir, Hamish said, his Highland lilt thicker than a winter porridge. I was just out for a bit of a stroll with lugs. The poor dog had a call of nature, you see, when I happened to trip over Mr. Johnson down by the Old Pier. He was having a bit of a struggle with a brass poker, and I thought to myself, Hamish, that is no place for a piece of fireplace furniture. Blair stood up, his interest piqued despite himself. A poker? Down at the pier? Aye, sir. Hamish nodded vigorously. It seems he was trying to hide it in the silt. But then I remembered what you said earlier, sir, your brilliant insight about the domestic nature of the crime. Blair blinked. He didn't remember saying anything of the sort, but the word brilliant acted on him like a tonic. He puffed out his chest. Go on, Macbeth. Well, sir, Hamish continued, leaning in as if sharing a confidence between two high-level professionals. I realised that everything you've been doing today, the way you squeezed that Arabella Thorne girl and the way you made life so uncomfortable for the locals, it was all designed to put the real killer under such a terrible pressure that he would finally crack. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, sir. I was just the one who happened to be standing there when the dam finally burst. Blair's face transformed. The plum-coloured irritation faded, replaced by a radiant, oily glow of self-satisfaction. He straightened his tie and looked at the shivering Mr. Johnson as if he were a trophy he had personally hunted down. Of course, Blair rumbled, his voice suddenly deep and authoritative. The pressure, the pincer movement of the investigation. I knew that by focusing on the vulture, I'd forced the local element into a panic. It's a classic Strathbane technique, Macbeth. Not that you'd understand the nuances of it. Oh, I don't, sir. Not a bit, Hamish said humbly. I was quite confused when I saw him, but then I saw the mud on his boots, the very black silt you pointed out earlier, sir, and I thought, the inspector is right again. It's all about the boots. Blair hadn't mentioned the boots either, but he was currently rewriting the history of the last 12 hours in his head with the speed of a tabloid journalist. He walked over to Johnson, loomingly largely over the broken man. So, Johnson, Blair sneered. Thought you could outsmart the CID, did you? Thought I wouldn't notice the connection between your family's pathetic little secret and Delancey's development? I've seen men like you before. You think you're part of the furniture, but you're just another criminal with a grudge. Johnson didn't look up. He just nodded slowly, his spirit entirely extinguished by the weight of the handcuffs and the sudden booming certainty of the man in front of him. Anderson, McNab, Blair barked, turning to his detectives. Get this man into the van. Secure the poker. It's the murder weapon. I want a full statement typed up by the time we hit the station, and make sure the chief constable knows that it was my interrogation of the hotel staff that broke the case. What about the constable, sir? McNab asked, glancing at Hamish. Blair looked at Hamish, lanky, dripping, and currently scratching his ear with a look of vacant contentment. Macbeth? He's a witness to the arrest, I suppose. Mention him in the footlights of the report. P.C. Macbeth was present at the scene. That's more than enough. We wouldn't want people thinking a village Bobby actually did any work, would we? It would look bad for the department. Oh, quite right, sir, Hamish said, hiding a small, secret smile. It would be a terrible thing if the papers started thinking I was anything but a simple man with a dog. I'd never hear the end of it from the neighbours. Exactly, Blair snapped. Now get out of my way. I have a press release to draft. This is the kind of result that gets a man a commendation, or a promotion to the head office. As the Strathbane team swept out of the hotel in a flurry of self-importance, hauling a sobbing Mr. Johnson between them, Hamish stood alone in the quiet lounge. The fire was dying in the grate, and the rain continued to lash against the windows. He reached out and snagged a half-eaten plate of sandwiches that Blair had abandoned on the table. There you go, Lugs, Hamish whispered, tossing a corner of ham to the dog. Blair gets his promotion, the village gets its peace back, and we get to stay right here in Lochdubh with no paperwork and a clear conscience. He felt a slight pang for Mr. Johnson, a man destroyed by a past he couldn't escape, but in the Highlands The mountains were old, and the secrets were older. You couldn't save everyone from the weight of the land. Hamish adjusted his cap, which was still slightly crooked, and walked out into the night. He had a poached salmon waiting for him at home, and for a man like Hamish Macbeth, that was a far greater prize than any medal DCI Blair would ever wear. The silence that followed the departure of the Strathbane CID was a tangible thing, heavy and soft like a fall of fresh snow. The sirens had faded into the distance. The neon-orange police tape had been cleared away by a disgruntled Archie MacLean, and the Lochdubh Hotel stood dark and quiet, its windows reflecting the brooding grey of the loch. PC Hamish Macbeth sat in his kitchen at the police station, the only light coming from the orange glow of the peat fire in his iron stove. The resource-managed salmon from the previous night was now simmering gently in a pan with a bit of butter and a splash of milk, the fragrance filling the small, cramped room and battling the ever-present scent of wet dog. Lugs was curled in his basket, occasionally twitching a paw as he chased imaginary rabbits through the heather of his dreams. He was a dog who appreciated the return to normalcy. The presence of city detectives always made the floorboards feel too crowded and the air too sharp with tension. A quiet knock at the door broke the stillness. Hamish didn't move, hoping it might be a ghost that would eventually wander off. But the knock repeated itself. 3 sharp, polite raps. He stood up, his joints popping, and opened the door to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was wrapped in a thick, cream-coloured cashmere coat, and her hair held tiny diamonds of mist. "I saw the lights were on," she said, her voice a calm melody against the Highland night. "I heard that Inspector Blair has made a spectacular arrest." "Aye," Hamish said, stepping aside to let her in. "He is a man of great spectacles, is the inspector. He is currently in Strathbane telling the world how his psychological pincer movement caught the killer." Priscilla stepped into the warm, slightly smoky kitchen, her presence making the room feel suddenly smaller and much shabbier. She looked at the simmering salmon, and then at the empty plastic evidence bag sitting on the table, the one that had supposedly held the confession letter. "It was blank, wasn't it?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "It was a list of groceries I'd forgotten to buy," Hamish admitted, his eyes twinkling. "Bread, milk, and a tin of floor wax." But to a man like Mr. Johnson, who was already drowning in his own history, it looked like a death warrant. "It is a terrible thing, Priscilla, to be so afraid of the past that you destroy your future." "And the development?" she asked. "Dead as a salt herring. The investors pulled out the moment the word murder hit the wires. The Watchman's Point will remain a pile of ruins and a place for the deer to sleep. The village is quite pleased, though they'll never admit it to a policeman." Priscilla leaned against the wooden dresser, her eyes soft as she watched him. "You saved that old man, Angus. And you solved it while Blair was busy shouting at gulls. Why do you let him take the credit, Hamish? You could be a sergeant by now. You could be in a better station, with a roof that doesn't leak." Hamish stirred the salmon, the steam rising around his face. "If I were a sergeant, Priscilla, I would be in Strathbane. I would be wearing a suit that itches and attending meetings about efficiency targets and community outreach. I would have no time for the river, and lugs would have no place to run. Here, I'm just a lazy policeman who occasionally trips over a murderer. It is a very comfortable life." "You are the most ambitious lazy man I have ever known," she whispered. She stayed for a cup of tea, real tea, brewed strong and dark, and they sat in a companionable silence that needed no explanation. When she finally left, her car's headlights cutting through the mist like twin swords, Hamish felt the familiar bittersweet tug in his chest. She belonged to the great house and the world beyond the mountains. He belonged to the peat and the salt. He returned to his stove and served himself a plate of the salmon. It was perfectly cooked, flaky and rich. As he ate, he picked up a copy of the Strathbane Gazette from the previous week. There was a small article on the back page about Crispin de Lancey's arrival in the Highlands, calling him a visionary of progress. Hamish shook his head. Progress in Lochdubh was measured in the growth of the lichen on the stones and the slow turning of the seasons. Anything faster than that usually ended in tears or a lobster pot. The phone on the wall began to ring. Hamish stared at it. It was likely the chief constable wanting a quote, or perhaps Blair calling to gloat one last time. He let it ring. He let it ring until the silence of the room reclaimed the air. He finished his meal, washed his plate, and turned down the lamp. The fire in the stove was a dying ember now, a small heart of heat in the cold Highland night. "Well, Lugs," Hamish murmured, climbing into his bed and pulling the heavy woolen blankets up to his chin. "The Sassenach is gone, the inspector is a hero, and the watchman is still watching. I believe we can afford to sleep until noon tomorrow." Outside, the rain began to fall again, a steady rhythmic drumming on the roof that sounded like a lullaby. Lochdubh was once again a village of secrets, tucked away at the edge of the world, and Hamish Macbeth, the laziest and smartest man in the Highlands, was exactly where he wanted to be. The sun made a rare apologetic appearance the following morning, casting a pale gold light over Lochdubh that made the wet slate roofs of the cottages shimmer like fish scales. The Strathbane Gazette had arrived on the early bus, and the front-page headline was as loud as one of DCI Blair's ties, Strathbane's finest crack Highland hate crime. Below the headline was a photograph of Blair looking grimly heroic, standing in front of the Old Pier. PC Hamish Macbeth's name appeared exactly once, buried on page 4, listed among other officers present. Hamish sat on the bench outside the post office, the paper spread across his knees. Lugs was busy investigating a particularly interesting scent on a nearby lamp-post. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and the faint, sweet smoke of morning fires. "A hero, is he?" Mrs. Wellington's voice drifted from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame, a duster in one hand and a look of profound scepticism on her face. "I see the inspector has discovered a talent for fiction that would put the great writers to shame. A meticulous pincer movement, indeed. The only thing that man moves is his fork toward a steak pie." "It is a very fine photograph of him, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, folding the paper with a contented sigh. "He has managed to tuck his second chin quite neatly into his collar." "He's a puffed-up toad," she sniffed, "and we all know who really sat in the gorse and caught that poor broken-souled Johnson." "The village isn't blind, Hamish, even if the chief constable is." "Och, the village has a very selective memory," Hamish murmured, "and that is exactly how I like it. If people started telling the truth, I'd be forced to move to a city where the air tastes like a bus exhaust, and I'd have to wear a tie every single day. I'm quite happy being a footnote on page 4. His moment of tranquility was interrupted by the sight of a small, mud-spattered Land Rover rattling down the street. It ground to a halt in front of the station, and a man in a sturdy green uniform with a peaked cap emerged. "The water bailiff," Mrs. Wellington whispered, her eyes narrowing. "Mr. Murray. He looks like he's on the warpath." Hamish felt a familiar, chilly sinking feeling in his stomach. He stood up slowly, adjusting his cap. Mr. Murray was a man who took the preservation of the local salmon population with a religious fervour that bordered on the fanatical. He approached Hamish with his thumbs tucked into his belt, his face set in a mask of professional suspicion. "Macbeth," Murray barked, "I hear there was a lot of activity down by the riverbank last night." "Police activity." "Aye, Mr. Murray," Hamish said, his voice dropping into its most vacant, helpful tone. "The CID was everywhere. They were scouring the banks for evidence, you see, trampling the reeds and shouting at the top of their lungs. It was a very noisy business." Murray scowled. And I suppose they were scouring for evidence with a three-pronged spear and a net. I found traces of a struggle near the deep pool, and some very distinctive footprints, size 13, I'd wager. Hamish looked down at his own large boots with a look of genuine surprise. Is that so? Well, it's a funny thing, Mr. Murray. But DCI Blair's detectives, huge men they are, all seem to have very large feet. Must be the city water. Makes the bones grow broad. Murray stepped closer, his eyes darting toward the chimney of the police station, where a thin curl of smoke was rising. And what's that I smell, Macbeth? That's not peat smoke. That's the smell of poaching. Specifically the smell of a fresh grilse being poached in milk. Oh, that? Hamish blinked slowly. That would be the medicine for poor Lugs. The vet, a very expensive man from Inverness, said the dog has a delicate constitution. He needs a bit of white fish to settle his humours. It's a tragedy, really. The cost of hake these days is enough to drive a man to drink. Hake, Murray repeated, his lip curling. I've never known a hake to have the silver scales I found in your bin this morning. Environmental contamination, Mr. Murray, Hamish said sadly. The loch is full of strange things these days. It's the global warming, I expect. Makes the fish look quite different than they used to. The two men stared at each other, a silent Highland standoff. Murray knew Hamish was lying. Hamish knew Murray knew. But without a search warrant or a smoking pan, the bailiff was powerless against the wall of polite stupidity Hamish had erected. Finally, Murray spat on the ground and turned back toward his Land Rover. I'm watching you, Macbeth. One of these days, I'll catch you with the scales still on your fingers. I shall keep an eye out for any suspicious fish, Mr. Murray, Hamish called out cheerfully as the vehicle roared away. Mrs. Wellington chuckled from the doorway. You're a wicked man, Hamish Macbeth. A wicked, clever man. I am a hungry man, Mrs. Wellington, Hamish corrected, and the medicine is getting cold. He whistled for Lugs and walked back to the station. Inside the small kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth. He finished the last of the salmon, sharing a final morsel with the dog, and then carefully washed the pan until it shone, leaving no trace of his resource management. He sat by the window watching the mist begin to roll back in from the Minch, swallowing the Watchman's point once again. The Sassenach developer was a memory, the murderer was in a cell, and the village of Lochdubh was returning to its ancient, slow-moving rhythm. Hamish leaned back in his chair, his feet up on the stove. He was a man of no importance, a failure in the eyes of his superiors, and a poacher in the eyes of the law. He had never been happier. "Aye, Lugs," he whispered, closing his eyes as the rain began to patter against the glass once more. "It is a grand thing, the peace of the Highlands. Long may it last."